This is Class 6 of the United States foreign policy in the 21st century, and today we want to discuss the Clinton administration in the 1990s with some emphasis on this idea of democratic enlargement, which was at the heart of his national security policies, certainly during his first term as president. Clinton, of course, president from 1993, beginning of 1993 to the beginning of 2001. So his presidency basically covered a large chunk of the 1990s. Before we talk about Clinton particularly, here is a headline from the Washington Post a day or two ago. Headline saying self-isolation leaves the United States out of customary leadership position. And the article is basically focusing on the United States' response to the coronavirus epidemic and some of the foreign policy implications of that. And the article basically arguing that the United States hasn't really played a very strong leadership role internationally during this crisis. And it's noting the fact that other countries, notably China and to some extent Russia, are sort of stepping into the vacuum which the United States has left. So it's noted that both China and Russia have sent medical supplies to other countries, perhaps attempting to sort of burnish their image, increase their influence. In contrast, obviously, the Trump administration's response to the outbreak of the epidemic inside the United States has courted quite a lot of controversy. There have been accusations that the United States has not dealt with the crisis particularly effectively. So aside from the sort of domestic health crisis and economic crisis that the United States, along with pretty much the rest of the world, are having to face at the moment, the crisis potentially could actually have some important foreign policy consequences for the United States. Again, it's far too early to tell how significant this is, but nonetheless, as I say, I think it's interesting to note, and as this article suggests, that there is certainly a potential sort of foreign policy dimension to this crisis. Should be noted as well the article written by Elizabeth Braw, who works for the London-based Royal United Services Institute, which is a sort of British-based think tank that produces commentary and publications on international affairs. Okay, let's turn to Bill Clinton and his administration, and here is a headline which I've taken from the BBC News website a couple of years ago. The headline saying that Kosovo's love affair with the Clintons. The subheading underneath the picture, Kosovo Albanians swear that they will never forget the role of the Clintons, spelled with a K, in the NATO bombing campaign, which brought an end to the conflict in 1999. So I would imagine, well, this is obviously a photograph of a street somewhere in Kosovo, probably, I'm guessing, Pristina, the main city in Kosovo. And yeah, as I say, interesting that 15 years, 15, 16, 17 years, I suppose, since the war. Clinton's reputation, Bill Clinton's reputation, obviously in Kosovo, is extremely positive, extremely good. Interestingly as well, I've heard that a lot of Kosovo children are named Tony Blair after the British Prime Minister, who also played a very strong role during the crisis at the end of the 1990s. Blair himself, if anything, I would say a much more passionate advocate of direct NATO intervention in Kosovo. But Clinton too, as I say, as the story shows, also very strongly remembered in Kosovo for the role that he played during this crisis. So the Kosovo War was certainly one of the biggest, if not the biggest, foreign policy issues with which Clinton had to grapple in the 1990s. We'll just move on to the next slide. And here we have a cartoon. I think this cartoon, yes, there is a date, 1990, not entirely clear, 1997 maybe, or maybe 95, not entirely sure. Anyway, but I think this cartoon basically drawn probably somewhere like the midway point, or maybe coming towards the end of Clinton's second term in office, perhaps mid to late 1990s. And again, the cartoon here depicting several sort of foreign policy issues which Clinton was having to attend. This is not a very flattering depiction of Clinton's foreign policy. Here, as you can see, he's got his guide dog, a stick, a white stick. Essentially, the cartoon is basically depicting Clinton as being a blind man, effectively being led. I think the dog is, it's called JC. I keep forgetting to check exactly who this is actually sort of who the dog actually represents. I thought it was Warren Christopher, his Secretary of State, but I'll say JC does not correspond with that. Tony Lake was Clinton's national security advisor, so it's not him. So anyway, I'm not entirely sure who the dog is. I will have to check that. But yeah, sort of being led blindly through these crises. I think what the cartoonist is saying, perhaps with some justification, was that Clinton was certainly not at the start of his presidency, somebody who was particularly interested or informed about foreign policy. Before Clinton became president, he'd been governor of Arkansas, which is a fairly small American state. If you're governor of Arkansas, you are not going to be deeply involved in foreign policy issues. And Clinton certainly, before he became president, did not particularly indicate or demonstrate that he was particularly concerned about foreign policy issues. In fact, shortly after he became president, in one account that I read somewhere, he apparently said, foreign policy is not what I came here to do. This is after he's entered the White House, which sort of demonstrated that he hadn't really looked very clearly at what the job description of an American president involves, because foreign policy is generally the area that presidents spend most time having to think about or consider. Cartoon also mentioning a couple of foreign policy areas with which Clinton was involved. Haiti, we'll talk about that in a moment, because that was pretty much right at the beginning of his administration. Bosnia, the wars in the former Yugoslavia were something that were basically dominated both Clinton's terms in office. The crisis was well underway even before Clinton became president, and throughout the 1990s, Yugoslavia was a sort of ongoing crisis, effectively culminating, as we mentioned a moment ago, in the Kosovo War in 1999. The Kosovo War in 1999, where Clinton decided to use NATO air power to bring that conflict to an end, and we will consider that in a moment. Another crisis, or ongoing crisis, which remains a problem to this very day, is North Korea. Clinton was grappling with how to try and prevent North Korea from going nuclear. There were several initiatives in the 1990s, none of which were particularly successful. And as I say, Clinton and then his successors as president, Bush, then Obama, and now Trump, all of these presidents have tried to come up with some kind of effective way of managing North Korea. None of them appear to have been very successful. Okay, the next couple of slides are sort of devoted to discussing the end of the Cold War and the administration of George H.W. Bush. This is George Bush Senior, president from 1989 to 1993. I don't want to spend too much time on these slides because I really want to keep the focus on Clinton. I think most of the bullet points have been taken from the kind of from the reading of this which accompanies this course, a chapter in the chapter by John Dumbrell in the textbook, but essentially, basically arguing here that once the Cold War has come to an end, American foreign policy and its national security strategies are sort of thrown into a state of flux. Nobody, having had a fairly sort of consistent policy throughout the Cold War of trying to contain the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union basically disappears at the end of 1991, it's not entirely clear what will actually replace this. Another thing to note about the Bush administration was that actually Bush was quite an effective foreign policy president. He chalked up several quite significant successes. Most notably, it's Bush who sort of plays quite an important, if not critical, role when it comes to German unification in 1990. The fact that ultimately the Soviet Union was persuaded through American and West German diplomacy to accept unification, and not only to accept unification, but to accept the fact that a unified Germany would remain part of NATO. That was seen as quite a significant success for American foreign policy. A couple of other points we could mention in passing: the denuclearization of the various post-Soviet republics, states like Ukraine, for example. That can also be viewed as a success. Most notably, 1990 and then 91, there's a crisis in the Middle East after Iraq invades Kuwait, and Bush masterminds an international coalition to liberate Kuwait, an operation authorized by the United Nations. And again, this is seen as a very sort of decisive American victory. Bush's popularity skyrockets. Many believed that it was almost certain he was going to be re-elected. Although, notably, although the United States wins the war, Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi dictator, was not deposed. He remained in power, which raised a bit of a question mark over exactly how successful this war actually was. And then in the background, beginning of the 1990s, you'd see the growing crisis in Yugoslavia. Bush actually warned Slobodan Milosevic, the leader of Yugoslavia, what were the rump of Yugoslavia, if I can put it this way. Milosevic was a Serb, so he was very much in charge of Serbia. Warning Milosevic not to intervene in Kosovo at the beginning of the 1990s. Many people believe that the crisis in Yugoslavia would probably begin in Kosovo for reasons we might discuss a bit later. In fact, it doesn't. Crisis really begins when Slovenia and Croatia decide to secede from Yugoslavia, which begins the wars. This happens in 92. The following year, in 93, Bosnia-Herzegovina follows suit. So the crisis in Yugoslavia kind of begins under the Bush presidency. Crucially, though, Bush decides he is not going to directly intervene. I think the attitude at the beginning of the 1990s was that Yugoslavia was a European problem, and therefore the Europeans would need to deal with it. At the end of his presidency as well, Bush also deployed military forces into Somalia, an operation which Clinton inherits at the beginning of his presidency, beginning of 93. A quotation on the next slide. Basically, George Bush talking about the conditions which need to be fulfilled when using military force. I won't read it out there, but suffice to say, in terms of the way the Bush administration uses military power, they were very clear that certain conditions needed to be fulfilled. Above all else, the thing that they really emphasized is that there needed to be a very clear military objective for when you deploy forces. I want to move on to the next slide, talk a little bit about Bill Clinton. As I said, 91, the United States goes to war, has a very successful victory over Iraq. President Bush's poll ratings are astronomical, somewhere in the 90s. Re-election is seemingly certain. In 1992, though, it is Bill Clinton who wins the Democratic nomination. Clinton, a relatively young man. I think he's the second youngest man to become American president after John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s. So Clinton captures the Democratic nomination and then mounts a very, very effective election campaign and defeats Bush. So Bush is basically a one-term president. The reason, the ultimate reason why Clinton wins is because the American economy is going into a recession, and Clinton very much campaigns on domestic issues. So he attacks Bush. I mean, his line is basically that Bush has spent far too much time on foreign policy issues and had not paid enough attention to America's domestic problems, especially the economy. Clinton says he will focus laser-like on the American economy. The unofficial slogan of Clinton's 92 campaign is, "It's the economy, stupid." So Clinton doesn't talk much about foreign policy. In fact, as I said, Clinton wasn't even particularly interested in foreign policy issues. On a couple of occasions, though, Clinton realizes he can't ignore foreign policy totally, so he does make a couple of speeches during the campaign which discusses foreign policy issues. Notably, Clinton attacks Bush for not having adopted a more decisive approach to the crisis in Yugoslavia. So Clinton intimated that were he to become president, he would actually he would adopt a rather stronger approach towards the crisis in Yugoslavia. Clinton wins, becomes president at the beginning of 93, and I think it's fair to say 1993 is not a good year for Bill Clinton, especially in the area of foreign policy. As I mentioned a moment ago, Clinton basically inherits a mission in Somalia from George Bush. Bush had sent military forces into Somalia on a humanitarian issue. Clinton basically takes over, and the operation basically goes very badly wrong for various reasons, which I won't actually go into too much detail now, but they will be mentioned in the textbook. Ultimately, though, American soldiers are killed. Some of them are dragged. Some of the bodies are dragged through the streets of Mogadishu in full view of the American media, and it's a major sort of foreign policy embarrassment. Ultimately, Clinton decides to actually withdraw America's military forces from Somalia. There's also a crisis involving Haiti when the president on the island is deposed. Clinton considers military intervention, but then sort of vacillates, hesitates. Ultimately, a sort of diplomatic agreement is brokered, which allows for the return of the Haitian president. But the general perception is that Clinton did not handle the situation particularly well. So the overall result of this is that Clinton basically gives the impression that foreign policy is not something that is going to be his forte. He's not going to be a great foreign policy president. And he certainly has his critics. I should say that the intervention in Somalia has some, especially I think, tragic consequences the following year, when there is a crisis in Rwanda. The there is increasing bloodletting between the two tribes in Rwanda. There's a genocide against the Tutsi tribe perpetrated mainly by the Hutus. And Clinton conspicuously decides that he is not going to intervene. In fact, the United States even declines to label the situation in Rwanda as a genocide, not least because under international law, because the United States was a signatory to the Genocide Convention. Had they done so, then they would have had an obligation to act to prevent this from taking place. So the United States very much stays on the sidelines during the mass killings in Rwanda. Subsequently, Clinton acknowledged that was a mistake. I think towards the end of his presidency, he visits Africa and he acknowledges that that his administration should have intervened to try and prevent that from taking place. So Clinton, as I say, subsequently acknowledges that he made a mistake. But the reason for Clinton's reluctance, I think, came out of the direct experience of Somalia. The fact that Somalia had gone badly wrong, American soldiers had been killed. Clinton simply did not want another repeat of that situation. Related to that, I think one final point before I move on to the next slide, is that Clinton, I think Neil Ferguson has made this point in one of his books. Clinton certainly had an aversion to body bags. He did not want to see American soldiers killed. Clinton grew up during the 1960s, had watched what had happened to his Democratic predecessor, Lyndon Johnson, and the way that the war in Vietnam consumed Johnson's presidency, and Clinton was adamant that this was not going to happen to him. So Clinton, very concerned to ensure that there weren't casualties during his presidency, or that casualties were minimized during his presidency. And this clearly is important when shaping his attitude towards this idea of military intervention. Okay, in the next slide, we've got some general observations about Clinton's foreign policy. First point is, Clinton, insofar as he does think about foreign policy, sort of does embrace liberal internationalism. I think Clinton is a good example of a reasonably liberal American president in terms of the foreign policies that he pursues. What does liberal internationalism entail? Well, first of all, I think it entails a willingness to work through international institutions. And indeed, this is the second point here, Clinton talks about this idea of assertive multilateralism. So by assertive, I think he is acknowledging that the United States must play a leadership role, but he also believes, and this is the multilateralism part, that the United States has to work alongside other countries. Another aspect of Clinton's thinking is that Clinton was very much a believer in globalization, and he was also a president who emphasized the importance of economics. So there's this talk of geoeconomics sort of guiding geopolitics. The relationship with China in particular, which is sort of late 80s, beginning of the 1990s, right at the beginning of its sort of trajectory of this sustained 2 or 3 decades of economic growth. So China is around this time that Sino-American relationship, the relationship between China and America begins to be viewed as being of particular, if not critical, importance. Point number 4, yes, the United States would work through international institutions to a large extent. And then another key aspect, and this is presented fairly early on in Clinton's first term as president. Clinton places, I suppose, at the heart of his national security strategy this notion of democratic enlargement. In some ways, I think this was seen as a potential replacement for the idea of containment, which had guided American policies during the Cold War. So democratic enlargement, which basically meant that he wanted, this is the final point on the slide here, that he wanted to expand the community of market-based democracies. Um, the enlargement strategy, so this is what I think is outlined in the Clinton administration's national security documents. Number one, as we just mentioned, this idea that the community of market-based democracies should be strengthened, and that the United States should foster and consolidate new democracies and market economies where possible. Counter-aggression and support for liberalization of states hostile to democracy. Again, China, I think, is a good example here. I mean, the United States sort of is starting to do an awful lot of business with China, but nonetheless, American officials feel that from time to time, at least, they have to sort of criticize China's human rights record. Number four, help democracy and market economies take root in regions of greatest humanitarian concern. Why democratic enlargement? Why does Clinton decide that this is something that the United States should be involved with? I think there are several reasons. One, as I say, Clinton is a liberal, so it's not that surprising that his foreign policy preferences would reflect his liberal values. More generally, I think Clinton, to some degree, buys into this idea of American exceptionalism, that the United States' model, its political model and its economic model have been very, very successful, and that what had worked for the United States could potentially work for other countries as well. The second point which says the distinction between domestic and foreign was breaking down. This is this idea that as a result of globalization, it was hard to make a clear distinction between domestic problems and foreign policy problems. So the classic example would be something like trade, which at one level is a sort of foreign policy issue, but which clearly has very direct consequences for people living inside the United States. Globalization basically meant that there are a number of processes, not just economic processes, but a number of processes which were cutting across state boundaries. So this idea that that you couldn't just ignore things that were happening, even if they happened to be far away, because potentially they could have quite a direct impact on the United States. And in general, the more countries which were democracies, the more stability there would be in the world. Third point, this idea of a third wave of democracy, an idea presented by the political scientist Samuel Huntington in the 1980s, which basically meant you were seeing more and more countries adopt democratic systems. This became especially apparent after the collapse of after the Soviet withdrawal from Eastern Europe in 1989, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. So early 1990s, it seemed that democracy was in vogue, if I can put it that way. More and more countries were adopting democratic institutions. As I say, it would lead to greater international stability, and East European states, like Russia, would become more normalized. Obviously, not just Russia, but you also have, the former, the East European countries, the former communist East European countries, countries like Poland, which were beginning to adopt democratic systems after 1989. Okay, and here we have a quotation from Madeleine Albright, who was Clinton's Secretary of State during his second term. So this was from 1997 to 2001, where she basically, I'm not going to read the whole quotation, you can do that yourself, but she's basically making the case as to why promoting human rights is important for the United States, and essentially saying that this is not something that it's just the right thing to do, but actually the United States actually would accrue benefits from if more and more countries across the world adopted these sorts of standards. How important was democracy promotion? Well, Michael Cox has argued that Clinton was careful not to oversell the policy. So Clinton basically did not want to appear too idealistic. He acknowledged that there were other factors which would influence America's foreign policy decisions. I mentioned China a moment ago. I mean, obviously China was not democratic. In fact, in 1989, the Chinese very bloodily put down protests in Tiananmen Square. That did not stop the United States from doing an awful lot of business with the Chinese in the years following. And as I say, although American officials sort of were prone to criticize the Chinese government, it didn't actually prevent them from doing that. So Clinton, as I say, certainly was not willing to sort of sacrifice America's major economic interests just on the grounds that the countries with whom the United States was trading were not particularly democratic. As I say, it was heavily qualified from the beginning, wouldn't heavily impinge on US economic interests in China. Clinton, anxious to improve America's access to international markets. And he also says that, military power, we might be living in a post-Cold War world with the threat of the Soviet Union having disappeared, but that did not mean that military power was still an important factor in international politics. So again, Clinton, keen not to appear overly idealistic in the way that he sort of manages American foreign policy. As I also mentioned, Clinton very much embraces globalization. So as I say, Clinton, quite a good example of a liberal American president. In particular, under Clinton, that NAFTA is signed and ratified in 1994. It should be said, Clinton inherits NAFTA from the Bush administration. So most of the work which had gone into drawing up the North American Free Trade Agreement was done by the Bush administration. But Clinton was happy to sign it and ratify it in 1994. Should be said, this has recently become much more controversial. President Trump, for example, has renegotiated NAFTA. Trump has been very critical. In fact, in fairness to Trump, he was very critical even at the time about these sorts of agreements. The critics have basically argued on both the left and the right that these free trade agreements basically meant that an awful lot of American jobs were shipped overseas to Mexico and other places. Clinton and those who supported this sort of liberalization of trade relations essentially argued that the United States would gain more than it lost. So although there was a risk that some jobs would be lost, the liberals essentially argued that the economic growth that the United States would accrue from these sorts of agreements would compensate for the loss of these jobs. As I say, in recent years, not everybody has necessarily agreed with that. So there has been something of a sort of backlash in the United States against NAFTA. So as I say, this part of Clinton's legacy has become rather controversial. So Clinton, in general, favouring free trade, but also acknowledging that there was a sort of dark side to globalization, that there were what I think Clinton at one point referred to as borderless threats of things like terrorism, drugs cartels, illegal immigration. So whilst Clinton says, yes, globalization is largely beneficial, there was a negative side to it which needed to be controlled. Clinton, though, like many liberals, argued that the keys to minimizing these sort of negative consequences was through multilateral action, so using international institutions, working with other countries to try and limit these sorts of activities. We mentioned China. Another country, or another major power with whom the United States was having to work with in the 1990s was Russia. We're going to talk much more about Russia on another occasion, so we'll talk a little bit about the relationship between Boris Yeltsin and Bill Clinton in a bit more detail when we talk about Russia specifically. In general, though, I mean, I say the first point that I said the United States strongly supported Boris Yeltsin. I think that's generally true. However, I think there's also an acknowledgement within the American national security establishment that Yeltsin as a figure was not somebody who did not have any faults. I think there was an awareness that Yeltsin was quite an unpredictable character. On the other hand, I think there's a judgment in the United States that there isn't anybody else in Russian politics with the stature and the clout, if you like, that could actually bring about the reforms that Russia really needed. Also, I mean, if you look at relations between America and Russia in the 1990s, they sort of go through periods of relative warmth and then other periods which are pretty cool. By the end of the decade, Yeltsin is talking about the fact that there was now a cold peace between Russia and the United States. Americans criticized Yeltsin for not having fully democratized Russia. In fact, by the end of the 90s, Yeltsin is looking like an increasingly sort of authoritarian figure. Ultimately, of course, it's Yeltsin who appoints Vladimir Putin to be his prime minister at the end of the 1990s and effectively clears the way for Putin to take over at the beginning of the 21st century. So there are certainly concerns about the lack of progress that Russia was making in terms of becoming a democratic state. The Russians, on the other hand, deeply resented NATO enlargement at the end of the 1990s. They argued that there had been some sort of agreement between the United States and Russia, or the former Soviet, what had been the Soviet Union, at the beginning of the 1990s, that these countries would not actually be admitted into the alliance. So the fact that NATO was enlarging and moving closer to Russia, that was a source of concern for the Russians. Also, America's interventions in Yugoslavia during the 1990s also created tensions between the United States and Russia, not least because Serbia was a historic ally of Russia. So the Russians felt that they had a duty to some extent to try and protect Serbian interests in the face of NATO's increasing activities within the former Yugoslavia. And as I said earlier, Yugoslavia is the crisis that's always rumbling in the background during the 1990s. This is the issue with which Clinton is really having to contend. I'm not going to give a very detailed description of the way that the war progresses in Yugoslavia. Aside to say that, the crisis really begins at the beginning of the 1990s. Comes to a head 1992 when Slovenia and Croatia break away, secede from the Yugoslavian Federation to become independent states. This sparks off a war between the rump of Yugoslavia and these two new states. The war between Slovenia and the Yugoslav Federation lasts only about 10 days before coming to an end. The war with Croatia lasts much longer, and then the following year, in 1993, Bosnia also secedes. So this becomes a major conflict right in the heart of, not in the heart of Europe, but in Europe, and not far from the core of Europe, if I can put it that way. Yugoslavia obviously bordering countries like Italy, Austria. So this becomes a major foreign policy problem, foreign policy issue for the United States. Initially, as I mentioned earlier, the Bush administration, which is in office right at the beginning of the crisis, was not interested isn't fair, but make it clear that they do not want to become directly involved, certainly not militarily involved in Yugoslavia. There's a very famous quotation from Bush's Secretary of State in which he said, "We have no dog in this fight. meaning that the United States had no direct interests in Yugoslavia. Lawrence Eagleburger, who also becomes Secretary of State at the end of Bush's administration, says of the Europeans they'll screw it up and that will teach them a lesson. But essentially, the American attitude is that this is a European problem and that the Europeans need to deal with it. The problem is that the Europeans ultimately prove that they are unable to effectively manage the crisis. One of the problems is that the Europeans fail to come up with a unified response to the crisis. As I say, this is the beginning of the 1990s. It's just before the Maastricht Treaty comes into force, which establishes the European Union. But there's still a lot of talk about a common European foreign policy and things like that. But as I say, there isn't really a common foreign policy in the early 1990s. So, for instance, in 1991, Germany unilaterally recognizes Slovenia and Croatia with no consultation with other European countries. This is Germany. This is Germany making that decision on its own, and a very important, very consequential decision, but not one which was, as I say, coordinated with other European states. As the crisis deepens, a UN protection force, UNPRO-4, is dispatched to Yugoslavia, mainly composed of European troops, European soldiers. In terms of how the crisis is managed, one possible plan is drawn up, which becomes known as the Vance-Owen Plan, named after the former American Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, and the former British Foreign Secretary, David Owen, which basically suggests what they describe as the cantonization of Bosnia. In other words, dividing Bosnia into lots and lots of little cantons, similar to the sort of Swiss model, some of which would be Serbian dominated, some of which Croatian dominated, some of which would be sort of dominated by Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks. The problem is the Clinton administration are unwilling to support this. They feel that this plan is effectively a plan which appeases Serbia, so they don't like it. So the Clinton administration basically torpedoes this plan. It basically says they would not support it, and the plan collapses. The problem, though, is that Clinton doesn't really have a much better idea. He doesn't have an alternative to put in its place. Clinton administration does, in 93, 94, propose what becomes known as lift and strike. Lift referred to the arms embargo, which the United Nations had imposed on Yugoslavia after the war had broken out. The Americans argue that this embargo penalized Bosnia and Croatia because they were unable to purchase arms, unable to purchase military equipment from other countries, whereas Serbia still had access to the Yugoslav army, which was pretty well equipped. So the Clinton administration proposed lifting the arms embargo in order to be able to supply military equipment to Croatia and Bosnia. They also proposed limited airstrikes against Serbian artillery, particularly Serbian artillery which was positioned around the city of Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. Christopher Warren, Clinton's Secretary of State, is dispatched to Europe to consult with the Europeans and is met with opposition. And I think here critics of Clinton would say this basically represents a failure of American leadership. Clinton was not entirely certain in his own mind what he wanted to do. He puts forth this proposal. It meets with European opposition, and then Clinton simply drops the idea. So it's a reflection, as I say, of Clinton's sort of indecision in the face of this crisis in the early 1990s. Critics basically argue that had Clinton really wanted to push this through, he could have done. He could have made it clear to the Europeans that this is what the United States wanted, and he expected the Europeans to fall into line. A contact group, though, is established in 1994, which is basically the United States, Germany, France, Britain, Russia, regularly sort of consulting with one another to coordinate their policies during the crisis. The wars in Yugoslavia go on, though. There are various sort of peace initiatives, none of which are particularly successful. It's not until 1995 that finally the international community takes action. Again, as this slide indicates, there are several reasons for that. One is the election of Jacques Chirac, who becomes president in 1995, who is a vociferous advocate for some form of military intervention in Yugoslavia. Even more significant is the revelation of what had happened in Srebrenica in July 1995. Srebrenica was a town or a city in Bosnia which was supposedly United Nations safe haven, which was supposedly protected by UN forces. What basically happens, though, is that a large number of Bosnian Serbs turn up at the town and basically demand that all the men from the town are handed over to them. They cart them away and massacre them. So thousands and thousands of men are massacred in Srebrenica, from Srebrenica. When this crime is fully revealed, international opinion, I think, suddenly hardens against Serbia. And finally, NATO decides to adopt this policy of lift and strike. So in 1995, you'd see a brief NATO military campaign with limited airstrikes against Serbian positions. This is combined with a very successful Croatian military offensive in the Krajina region, which is a region that borders with, which is in the borderlands between Serbia and Croatia. And Milosevic very quickly capitulates. And eventually all the major political figures are basically shipped out to an American air base in Dayton, Ohio. A peace settlement is reached. Richard Holbrooke, very senior American diplomat, oversees this process. And as I say, that the result is a Croatian Bosnian Federation and an autonomous Serbian Republic. So the war is finally brought to an end. Lessons from the intervention. Well, first and foremost, it sort of does reveal European political and military weakness. So as I say, initially, it's left to the Europeans to manage the crisis, but ultimately, they fail to contain the conflict. And the Americans are sort of gradually drawn in. They assume an increasingly important role to the point at which finally, in 1995, Clinton decides that NATO air power is in fact going to have to be used. So it does emphasize the continued importance of the United States. As I say, that sort of reverses American isolationist instincts. It makes it clear that the United States still has an important role to play in European affairs. It also increases support for NATO expansion. There's a feeling that it might be a good idea to push NATO further east, not least because there's a feeling that NATO, if nothing else, can play quite an important stabilizing role within the region. The Europeans themselves also realized that there was a need for some form of EU military dimension, that there should be some kind of European military defense policy. So European EU defense policy. And in 1998, as a result of that, you have the St. Malo Declaration between Britain and France, the two main, I suppose, kind of European military powers, which pledge that they will cooperate and coordinate their policies and try and promote this idea, as I say, of a European defense policy. After the wars in Croatia and Bosnia are effectively brought to an end in 1995, the next flashpoint is Kosovo. As I mentioned at the beginning, actually, in some ways, many people thought Kosovo would be where the wars would actually begin. As I said at the beginning, the Bush administration essentially sends a message to Milosevic, basically telling him not to intervene or not to send military forces into that particular province. But the situation in Kosovo finally sort of explodes at the end of the 1990s. Kosovo, historically very important to Serbia. It was actually part of Serbia proper. Unlike Croatia and Bosnia, which were sort of separate, separate parts of the federation. Historically, the Serbs had actually lost a battle in Kosovo, I think, in the 14th century, to the Ottoman, to the Ottoman Empire, which also cemented its importance. But Kosovo, ethnically, Kosovo was although it was part of Serbia, ethnically, Kosovo was 90% Albanian. So Kosovo Albanians were the vast majority of the population. They were Muslims, like Bosniaks. And in the 90s, there was a sort of campaign of resistance conducted by Kosovo Albanians to Serb rule there. Initially, it's non-violent, but towards the end of the 1990s, you see the emergence of what's in English is referred to as the Kosovo Liberation Army, some sort of paramilitary force, which the Serbs described obviously as terrorists. And their campaign against their activities were almost designed to provoke the Serbian military into committing atrocities. In that they are successful. So the political situation and the humanitarian situation in Kosovo begins to break down in the 1990s. The Europeans and the Clinton administration, drawing upon their previous experiences, decide this time they are not going to wait for the crisis to really just spill over, and that they are going to act more decisively. So the various parties are again shipped out to Paris this time, French Chateau, Rambouillet, just outside Paris, and they are all sides are basically presented with a peace agreement, basically calling for Serb military forces to withdraw, Kosovo to be given some sort of autonomy, with NATO effectively administering the province. But crucially, it would actually still remain part of Serbia. So Kosovo was not being offered independence. The agreement actually doesn't satisfy anybody, really. The Serbs dislike it intensely, but the Kosovo Albanian political leadership were also unhappy because it was not promising them full independence. But it's sort of made clear to them that if they don't actually sign the agreement, then NATO would not actually intervene. So reluctantly they sign, and this creates the conditions which leads to a second NATO military intervention against Yugoslavia. The expectation is that just as the 1995 bombing campaign had led to a very quick Serbian capitulation, you were going to see something similar again. But it doesn't. This ends up being a much, much more protracted military campaign. So the war lasts 78 days, which on the face of it doesn't seem particularly long, just over 11 weeks. But as I said, it is much, much longer than NATO was expecting, and it becomes increasingly controversial. NATO itself is pretty divided. There are a number of NATO members, especially Greece and Turkey, who are very unhappy with the campaign to begin with. As it drags out, as it becomes clear there isn't going to be a very quick resolution to it, they make their misgivings become even more pronounced. Furthermore, the campaign doesn't actually stop the atrocities that the Serbs are perpetuating against the Kosovo Albanians, so people are questioning whether this is particularly wise, not least because Clinton insists that the intervention has to be limited to air power. So it's going to be limited to a bombing campaign. Clinton makes it clear he is not willing to countenance any sort of ground forces being deployed in Kosovo. So the campaign goes on. More and more atrocities are perpetrated by the Serb forces in Kosovo. I've got a statistic there: an estimated 30,000 Albanians are killed, 1 million forced from their homes. Furthermore, there's also debate over the legal justification for the war. The fact is that the United Nations did not authorize it. Russia and China on the United Nations Security Council make it clear that they would veto any resolution that authorized military action. So NATO goes ahead despite the fact that there isn't a clear legal authorization for the war. The United States itself also becomes increasingly frustrated with what they view as war by committee. There's a feeling amongst United States military commanders and indeed in the government that the Europeans are having too great a say when it comes to how the campaign should be conducted. And the crisis deepens. I mean, towards the end, Clinton finally decides that perhaps it is going to be necessary to send in military forces into Yugoslavia, simply because, as I say, it seems as though perhaps Serbia is not going to, capitulate. Otherwise, eventually they do. Not least, I think, because the Russians finally intervene. They tell Milosevic that if he doesn't actually, negotiate, then a direct American intervention or ground intervention would be almost inevitable. So eventually a settlement is reached. But what some authorities have noted is that the eventual settlement is actually slightly different, or actually significantly different from the one that they had first agreed or had first presented the Serbs at Rambouillet. In particular, whereas Rambouillet had basically given NATO forces sort of open access to Kosovo, and that they would be allowed to transfer, so that they would be allowed to move over Serb territory. Rambouillet basically stipulated that this would no longer be a sort of requirement. So NATO did actually make one or two concessions in order to bring the war to a conclusion. That concludes the class on Clinton's foreign policy. As I say, probably the biggest crisis of Clinton's presidency was the biggest foreign policy problem, I would say, during Clinton's presidency was the situation in Yugoslavia. There were other issues which I kind of mentioned in passing, but haven't gone into any detail. I mean, yes, Clinton also attempts to deal with North Korea, tries to reach some sort of agreement, understanding there with the North Koreans, but eventually, these negotiations or these agreements are never prove to be entirely satisfactory. There are also limited strikes against Iraq as well during the 1990s. So Iraq is another issue that is there in the background. But as I say, of all the problems that Clinton is handling, Yugoslavia, I think, was probably the biggest, and the one that I think eventually sort of comes to dominate his foreign policy priorities during his presidency. Okay, and I will bring it to a conclusion at that point.